Hello, everyone. For 3.2, you're going to be reading a bit of your books, and we're going to talk about characterization and genre. So let's dive right into it. Genre means the category of or type of literary work, such as comedy or horror. So, for example, if I'm scrolling on Netflix and I click the horror tab, I'm going to get movies like Scream and Friday the 13th and The Substance, and I'm probably not going to get many romantic comedies or things like that. So, genres help us categorize things with similar expectations. Same thing is true with stories. Comedy and horror are genres of literature and books as well as movies and shows. We're going to be talking about two particular genres that are applicable to the books in our unit. The first is memoir. Memoir is a type of nonfiction, so a true story, that is about the author's own life. So, for example, if you look at the center there, you may have heard of The Diary of a Young Girl by Anne Frank. This is her real diary that she kept while living in hiding during the Holocaust. It is a true story from her own perspective. Memoir is the same, but instead of being written as a diary, it's told as just a story overall. While the Locust Slept is an example of a memoir. The author, Peter Razor, is talking about his own life, telling it to us as a story. The other genre we're looking at is historical fiction. So, a fictional story is something that is not real. Historical fiction means it's not real, but it is based on actual history. So, for example, we read the play A Raisin in the Sun. This is based off of real life in Chicago in the 1950s, but the specific characters, the specific events that happen, didn't really happen. They're made up. You probably read Of Mice and Men last year, and that's another example of historical fiction. It's set during a real time period and it's meant to be realistic, but the specific characters are made up. Ouijawaganug is historical fiction. The characters of Nij and Roger are not actual people, but the setting very much is. It is true that in 1891, laws were passed that forced Indigenous children to go to these boarding schools. So, with memoir, you're looking at an absolutely true story where someone is describing their own life. With historical fiction, you're looking at a made up story, but one that is based on the real world and real history. Characterization is a really important part of stories because it's how we learn who people are. It's the way characters are described or represented. So, for example, if we think back to Raisin in the Sun, this is part of the initial description when Walter is first introduced. He is a lean, intense young man in his middle 30s, inclined to quick nervous movements and erratic speech habits. Before Walter has said a single word, we get a description of him. We know his age, we know physically what he looks like, we know a bit about his personality, and then, of course, he will continue to be characterized as we see him walk, talk, and act. In a memoir, characterization is meant to show us the way the people really were in life, although from the perspective of the author. In historical fiction, the characters are made up, so they're described in a way that the author chooses to get their message across. Two types of characters are protagonists and antagonists. We can help understand a story by looking at who these are. So, first off, what do these mean? The protagonist is the main character of the story. They're the one that we're following, the one with the mission. The antagonist is anti the protagonist. They're against them. So they're the person or thing that is keeping the protagonist from their goals. Sometimes this can mean a villain, Dr. Octopus, for example. But an antagonist doesn't have to be evil. An antagonist could be your friend who is distracting you from your goal of doing your homework. Well, in that moment, they're keeping you from your goals. An antagonist can also be just a thing. If you have 20 minutes left to finish your homework before class, maybe the clock itself is your antagonist. It's not evil, but it's what's against you right now. So, thinking about Raisin in the Sun, some antagonists from that story would be Willie Harris, the man who steals Walter's money. Walter himself is an antagonist to many of the Younger family. He gets in their way by making bad choices. And the forces of poverty and racism work as antagonists in A Raisin in the Sun. They are obstacles keeping the Younger family from their goals. So, what about in our stories? Let's start with While the Locust Slept. So, in While the Locust Slept, the protagonist is the author, Peter Raiser. So, who's in his way? So far, there are several options. The state public school at Owatonna could be considered an antagonist. John Scholes, who we will learn more about as you keep reading, could be considered an antagonist. And racism could definitely be considered an antagonist because Peter Raiser is discriminated against and treated differently because of his race. As you keep reading, watch for how both Peter, his antagonists, and others in the book are characterized. How are they described? What do we know about them? Now let's do the same thing for Ouija-Waganug. In Ouija-Waganug, there are actually two protagonists, Nej Ashkenag and Roger. At this point in the story, they have very different goals and they're facing very different antagonists and different obstacles. But some of the antagonists we've seen so far could be the boarding school at Polville, where Nej is forced to speak English, and where Roger is forced to go after the death of his parents. Karen Poznansky, Roger's foster mom, could also be an antagonist. She's pretty cold to him and very strict. And again, racism can absolutely be an antagonist for Nej at this point in particular, who again is treated differently, especially when he tries to embrace his Ojibwe culture and speak his own language. Again, as you keep reading, look for how both of our protagonists are characterized. How are they described in similar and different ways? And how do they face similar or different antagonists? So that is it for our video to start off 3.2. Make sure you filled in the Cornell notes in your packet. And for the next step, you'll be reading a little farther in your books.